Hello and welcome to Newsfire. I'm Ayza Omar. India's advance payment of $800 million for Russia's S-400 anti-aircraft missile systems comes pretty much as a confirmation that India is going ahead with buying the Russian weapons despite threats of US sanctions. So is New Delhi hoping for a waiver from Washington? Is that even a possibility considering the kind of rocky relationship the two have been having lately? And how do we see President Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy really playing out as opposed to how it's been spelled out in letter? Now, according to a US law, Washington could impose sanctions under its Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, shortly known as CAATSA, which targets any country that purchases military equipment from Russia, and it targets them with sanctions. And while we examine that relationship today, we will also be asking our guests for insight on how the US proposes to continue with threats to Egypt, also a Russian weapon buyer, and Turkey, who has already received several payloads of the anti-aircraft defense system. Also, what we're going to be exploring is why are Russian weapons now all the rage? Is it technological superiority and a lower price point alone determining this trend, or also the geopolitical shift, which is essentially by some seen as perpetuated, some argue, by Trump's isolationist policies? So let me introduce our guest who has joined us today. We have with us Mr. Mark Sleboda. He's an analyst and a weapons expert joining us from Moscow. And from Islamabad, we have Lieutenant General Naeem Khalid Lodhi. He's joining us also as an analyst to shed some light on this situation. I want to start with you, General, if I may, that the situation as we see, there are several countries right now, most of them close allies of the US, going ahead with purchases of important weapon systems from Russia. It is, of course, understood that Russia has been a pretty big supplier of weapons in the decades past. But what we're seeing with India's confirmation of this payment, this advance payment, can we expect any kind of reprimand from the US towards India?
As far as India is concerned, I think we'll have to compare that, keeping in mind the strategic relationship which US has now got with them, and for what purpose. Now, the thing is that in this region, in South Asia, they have to rely on India as far as countering China is concerned. And I don't think that they can afford to really have any weakness in the relations. They have a number of pacts with them. We are aware of that. And before also we know that they also gave them waiver once it came to Iranian oil and such things. So I am of the opinion that they will threaten India, all right. We know that they are also having some problems in the trade and such like things, but still they would like to maintain the relationship. And this purchase of S-400 is not likely to make a big dent. Of course, they will threaten them, all right, because actually they wanted to sell their own systems, the Patriot and their advanced versions. But S-400, as our Russian friend is going to tell you, is one of the best anti-ballistic missile system, one of the best anti-aircraft systems accepted by everyone in the world. So that is why that Turkey went for it, and other countries are also, trying to buy that. So my own, I would say that they will go for it. They are already going for it, Indians, for the purchase of these missiles, and ultimately US will have to settle down with it.
Okay, so Mr. Sleboda, let's take on this also, considering while there's one argument that the US really needs India, but then it could be argued that they've been seeing a lot of ups and downs. Just this year, in June, we saw the US essentially take India off its preferential list because they said that India wasn't playing fair in terms of allowing access to American goods in its market. And so the effect it essentially had on India was somewhat of a small nature, 12%, about 6.5 billion, I believe, were affected in terms of 6.35 billion worth of Indian exports to the US were compromised. How do you see it? Do you see that importance or that relationship between US and India?
Yeah, that the U.S. feels the necessity to resort to these types of bluster and threats shows the real fear they have, first of all, of this weapon system and its deployment around the world. And secondly, of Russian arms manufacturers increasing strength on the global market and their ability to compete. Despite all the rhetoric about free market of the U.S., they see that they're continually resorting to threats, not just against neutral countries, but against its own allies to keep them from purchasing Russian weapon systems. And India is no exception to this rule. However, I do feel, as our esteemed general from Pakistan has already opined, that this is mostly bluster. And the U.S. will eventually, in a year and a half, when these systems might actually begin to be delivered, that the U.S. will issue a waiver to CATSA, to the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act for India. One, because of they require India for what they believe is the requirement for a geopolitical containment of China. And two, because the U.S. has been making some inroads as a weapons supplier to India over the past decade, and such heavy-handed tactics trying to deny India's sovereign right to buy arms from whatever country they want to could threaten future U.S. military supplies, not just to India, but to countries around the world. So this type of mafia-like threats is really counterproductive at the end of the day.
That's an interesting point. So essentially you're saying it's a two-pronged sort of double whammy to the U.S. If it tries to put pressure on India, it faces losing arms sales that it seems to have been growing with India in the past decade or two, like you mentioned. But at the same time, it sees India as a major ally in countering China. But General, if that is the case with India, what about Egypt? They've been long-term allies. They've been the recipient of billions of dollars of aid from the U.S., military help as well, military sales as well. But now we've seen the U.S. issue a letter of warning to Egypt in order to sort of prevent them from going ahead with their purchase of Russian weapons system. Do you expect them to treat Egypt the same way or differently than how they've treated India and Turkey?
In fact, I feel that America recently has been using its prowess of putting sanctions on various countries a bit too much, and probably more than its actual prowess, because one of the international sanctions one can understand if it comes from UN side or from any group of countries, it is understandable. But US trying to sanction countries unilaterally, and a number of them, and by now I think the number must be more than 20, 25. So as we have more economic blocks coming up, and as we have more political blocks coming up in the shape of China, Russia, and Turkey being a very close ally, I don't think that these sanctions could be very effective, especially once the countries have some alternatives available to them. So I think U.S. will be doing good service to themselves if they start, putting these sanctions less and less on countries, and especially on their friends. So I think these things will get diluted with the passage of time, because alternative power poles are coming up, alternative weapon suppliers are coming up. So ultimately, they'll have to review this policy of every second day threatening some country about sanctions and all that. So I don't think they will be able to actually implement these sanctions to a great extent. Yes, they have been able to, successfully implement such sanctions where they were helped by their allies, such as Iran. They put sanctions against Iran and some other countries, Venezuela, etc., where they are helped by other countries also. But America going unilaterally for these sanctions, yes, it used to be very effective. It can remain effective for another few years, but ultimately it is getting diluted, and they will have to review this, behavior of theirs.
Okay, and so Mr. Sleboda, go back a few steps. Let's try and get a bird's eye view and examine how you see this transition from the time when NATO was made, the Cold War era, where there were essentially just two big guys in the playground, US and USSR, to after that, the U.S. domination for 2 decades in foreign policy, in sort of global geopolitical strategy. And then this current era, would you say that this is an era where it's a world, a multipolar world?
Yeah, we're in an era of emerging multipolarity, and there is a lot of pains growth pains and protestations from the U.S. The U.S. And its allies are trying to shut down this era before, it becomes fully viable. They've got an increasingly small window of opportunity the way they see it. I think it's already far too late for them, but they see a 10 to 15 year window when China and Russia and other emerging global powers have enough military strength to deny them full spectrum dominance, as I see it, global military hegemony. And weapon sales to India are a case in point about this. The U.S. preferred method of war is bombing countries from afar without putting its own troops at risk, right? Which also is cost-effective means of conducting warfare. The problems with Russian air defenses like the S-400 is its A2AD, area anti-access, area denial. And it terrifies U.S. Generals and geopoliticians, because where this system grows up, they can no longer bomb it well. Sure, they can overwhelm this system with an application of enough force, cruise missiles, stealth bombers, but they'll take heavy casualties and high cost in the result. So whenever this system goes up around the world and at its highest with its best tools, it covers a 400-kilometer range. It's an enormous range on this system. It's extremely effective. So they don't like to see it going up around the world. And then on top of that, whenever you're conducting arms sales of advanced equipment like this, you're not only committing to an economic deal for weapons, you're actually committing to political, military, and economic relationships, because these weapons require military trainers. They require exchange of military technical cooperation. They require all of this requires supply chains, a long-term economic logistics commitment, and all of this means a political relationship as well. So the U.S. weapon systems like this are the literal personification of unipolarity slipping away out of their grasp.
So, Mr. Sleboda, you're an expert. You can shed more light in this. It seems like there is definite technological advancement in the Russian weapon system here. But is there also a question of how both systems would work together? The U.S. weapons and Russian weapons for a country that is a buyer, or purchaser, or user of both systems?
Yeah, so Turkey is the perfect example of this. It is a NATO member. It relies for the majority of its weapons on NATO military equipment. However, for its national interests, the Erdogan regime in Turkey has determined it needs Russia's S-400 system. Why? Because it fears a threat from NATO planes and from its own air force because of the recent coup attempt, where the majority of the coup was carried out of the Air Force using NATO fighters, F-15s, F-16s, French fighters, etc., that nearly shot down Erdogan's own personal air flight system. U.S. air defense systems cannot be used because of identify friend or foe on NATO-supplied airplanes. So this system provides a means of defense, first of all, against an overly aggressive NATO, which has been, pushing meddling and regime changes at the flip of a coin around the world, but also against the potential of military dissent, coups from within Turkey's own military, which is a long history in Turkey of military coups, using NATO aircraft against their own government. This system would allow them to shoot down NATO planes, whether flown by their own pilots or by NATO's.
That is a really interesting point there, Mr. General. If I can come to you on this. So essentially what we've heard is that they're hedging, clients are hedging their bets. Turkey is one example. But these sort of securing themselves, not only whether from threats within their borders, but also maybe from U.S. foreign policy. Is that at all reflective? Is this the lack thereof of this cohesive foreign policy that we're seeing during Trump's tenure?
That is natural that whenever countries they project their security requirements, they do keep in mind what all threats are presently and what future threats are possible. So you're right in your assessment that things can change in future, and countries they do take precautions in all directions. So that could be one of the reasons. But I think the main reason for the purchase of S-400 by so many countries is because of its efficiency, because of its well-known prowess, range, as my brother has just said, more than 400 kilometers, and up to an altitude of, I think, 180 or 200 kilometers. And they cover a very large area. It is known as Iron Dome because it creates such a defensive system that nothing can enter in that dome. So it is because of its well-known efficiency that the countries are going for it. And another thing is the comparative cost. I'm not really aware of how much,
right. But General, if I may interrupt
system,
here, what's so the effect this has for the region, India going ahead and purchasing this very advanced system from Russia, especially for its neighbor that is Pakistan, which has had a very strained relationship lately?
It will definitely tinker with the stability, the deterrent stability in this region, and the strategic stability. And we have a very good example that while during the Cold War, there was a treaty between erstwhile USSR and America on anti-ballistic missile system, not deploying the anti-ballistic missile system, so that both the sides they remain vulnerable to each other, which creates a sort of stability for the deterrence. Actually, what India is doing is going to dilute that stability, and Pakistan will have to find ways and means of overcoming it. That is a very dangerous step in its own way. So this point which you have brought out is important. It has got significance, and Pakistan must take up this point at international forums that we are trying our best to deter war, and we are also trying our best that there should be no war in the region. But if this stability is tinkered with and it goes in favor of India, it will give them an incentive to attack Pakistan. And this is, I think, more important for us, and it is more dangerous for the region and also for the world, which they must consider.
So that is a big concern, especially after what we've seen over months of a human rights violation of what could possibly amass genocide, since there's complete curfew and blockade of information from Indian-occupied Kashmir. However, Mr. Sleboda, let me ask you this. The U.S. is also known for holding back or denying sales of weapons to countries that are known to be human rights violators. And there have been several cases where the U.S. Congress has refused to let the arms sales go ahead because of the country for, carrying human rights violations. Now, in this case, where India has found a buyer, has found Russia as a substitute, is there absolutely any pressure that the U.S. could impose from that angle?
Regard when the U.S. applies the sanction of human rights against other countries to be full of absolute irony and more than 10 degrees of hypocrisy here. This is obviously applied completely selectively. And of course, the U.S. itself is never itself guilty of human rights violations, despite Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and so on. However, Russia doesn't make such judgments in its foreign policy. It conducts business, it conducts arms sales, and it has strong strategic partnerships. And Russia has long had a strategic partnership, both military and technical, and in other ways with India. And this weapon system is very important for India, primarily because Russia has already supplied this system to China. And India needs this system for its own defense, not only with concerning its relations with Pakistan, but also as a geopolitical hedge against China. And in that regard, the U.S. actually should be grateful for Russia for providing this system to India, because in India that is too weakened in the face of China, particularly when it comes to ballistic and air defense, is not in their own interest. So this is really kind of Russia regionally balancing global politics with respective arms sales to both sides.
And how does it affect the EU Indo-Pacific strategy that's pretty much come in during this Trump tenure from Rex Tillerson, the former U.S. Secretary of State? How does it reflect on the cohesiveness that he has talked about, that all countries, including India and west of India till the west coast of the U.S.? I mean, doesn't it essentially go pretty much against what they've been hoping to achieve with that?
First I will agree with Mark that as far as the human rights violation and such like things are concerned, I think they are very selective as far as the application is concerned. Now, once it comes to this strategy in this region, I think the compatibility, which you also raised the question a little while ago, is not a big problem nowadays because of advancement in IT and the software, which is, it yourself that Pakistan uses aircraft made in, America and China and France, and we have been very successfully integrating them with our air defense systems and all that. We also have air defense systems from various countries. So those problems have been overcome. So as long as the allies, they can have some common communication systems, these things will not have a big problem. So I agree with Mark once he says that India probably will use the Chinese bogey to justify the induction of these weapons, and probably America will settle down for that. And as I see that, as I initially said that they are getting that superpower status is going to last not very long, and other poles are coming up, and other options are coming up. So ultimately, probably they will settle down with all these purchases, and they will. In fact, very soon they will find that now what they are doing is they are shedding away as far as their allies are concerned. They are making more enemies. And the time is going to come when this phenomenon will stop, and they will again start collecting allies, more allies, and reduce the number of enemies, because they would need that once if they have to compete with Russo-China bloc as such per se. So I think they will have to review this attitude, but how long it takes, we'll see.
How long it takes and what kind of impact it would have, especially South Asian region, which has already been mired in so many tensions. Mr. Sleboda, last question to you. We're running out of time. 62% by some accounts, by some reports, is what the import of weapons is from Russia in India. Now with this current move, how do you see the dynamic changing as per what kind of role Russia and the US and China are going to have in this region?
Okay, so India is the world's number 2 arms importer after Saudi Arabia, which of course buys the vast majority of its weapons from the United States. And while Russia is a little bit on the upswing with its arms sales to India increasing from 58 to 62%, that's actually down from 76% just over a decade ago. India is continuing to diversify its arms supply from the U.S., from Russia, also from France and the U.K. and a few other countries. And this is really a smart foreign policy that any country with the capability will continue in order to prevent themselves from being locked into block geopolitics or one supplier, particularly one such as the U.S., which rather heavy-handedly meddles in dictating other countries, not only their foreign policy orientation, but often their domestic politics as well.
Mr. Mark Sleboda, thank you so much. And General Lodhi for joining us here on this debate over what is the future for not just US-India relations, but also the role that Russia continues to play as an increasing percentage of weapon supplies are coming from Russia for various countries, which have most importantly been allies of the US. And with that, we'll take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says that the United States will not consider Israeli settlements in the West Bank as a violation of international law. Now, he has essentially reversed an Obama administration position. Not only that, but he's kicked international law right out the door and pretty much kissed goodbye any hope for progress on peace efforts for Palestinians. What is essentially the motive behind President Trump's latest move? It isn't a complete surprise because in December 2017, 2017, Mr. Trump formally recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and ordered the United States Embassy to move there from Tel Aviv. Essentially a symbolic decision, but it was enough to outrage Palestinians who also claim territory in the city. And this isn't the only example. There have been a plethora of examples during President Trump's tenure that go to say how far he seems to want to go to support Israel. Now, considering he's campaigning hard for the 2020 presidential elections, while mired in a messy impeachment inquiry, the question is also, is there a hefty domestic political payoff here? All this and more we'll be discussing today with our guests. Let me introduce who we have today. We have Miss Mary Saliba, Middle East expert, joining us from Sydney. And we have Mr. Yousef Ghaben, a journalist with the Palestinian Journalist Bloc in Gaza, joining us from Gaza. Welcome to both of you. I'd like to start with you, Mr. Yousef, if you could shed some light on the kind of reaction. Clearly must be a lot of outrage from Palestinians in Gaza that have just seen terrible violence in the past few weeks, especially the last week, where 34 Palestinians were killed in air raids done by Israeli forces. After this statement from Mike Pompeo, what is the sentiment like on the street?
Actually, this new resolution by the U.S. administration is not new, and it does not surprise us as Palestinian people, because we have other previous resolutions, such as confessing and recognizing the Jerusalem as a capital for Israel and eliminating the two-state solution also. Also, we have another resolution by Trump administration when it recognized the Golan Heights as Israeli land. And the new resolution by U.S. administration, like I have said, does not surprise us, because I think we cannot separate it from what's going on inside the Israeli occupation. Inside Israel and the action of the Prime Minister. If you notice that Trump made such decisions when his friend Netanyahu and his ally Netanyahu faces problems with other parties inside Israel. Now Netanyahu faces a problem in forming a new government, and his shares are so low. So the Trump step comes to raise the shares of Netanyahu inside the Israeli community. And we also know that the presidential elections in the USA are highly affected by the Jews and those loopies which are controlled by pro-Israeli people. I think it's mixed, and the interests of Netanyahu and also Trump are the same. Because of that, we saw such resolution by the U.S. administration that admit the Israeli settlements, illegal settlements in the West Bank, are no longer illegal for the United States. And I think the whole world have seen their reactions by the main powers and the main states in the world. We have the European Union, we have other states who stress that the Israeli settlements in the Palestinian territories, and especially in the West Bank, are illegal, and they will still like that. According to the Palestinian reaction here in the Gaza Strip, I think people here recognize what's going on, and the relation between U.S. administration led by Trump and also the current government led by Netanyahu. And we think that the U.S. administration are taking such steps and making these resolutions in order to enhance the opportunities for Netanyahu to have another era of government, of being in government, and also for Trump to have more shares and more opportunities to be re-elected as U.S. president.
Right.
And we think such resolutions do not change the reality that the Israeli occupation is illegal, and everything coming up from such resolutions are illegal.
Okay, so Ms. Mary, let's get your take on this. Do you agree with this is a foreign policy decision where President Trump is essentially trying to help out Prime Minister Netanyahu, especially at a time where just tomorrow, on Thursday, if Benny Gantz succeeds to make that coalition government, it's pretty much goodbye for Netanyahu?
Absolutely. I think Yousef has made some excellent points, and I agree with all of them. There's just a few things we need to take into account, that this is not the first time the U.S. administration has deemed these settlements as illegal or not illegal. We have seen this type of fluctuation in U.S. presidential history before. It has been inconsistent. In 1978, under the Carter administration, the settlements were deemed as illegal. Then later on in 1981, President Reagan deemed that, well, they're not illegal. He saw that the settlements were not illegal. So there has been a subsequent shift in U.S. administration over this issue. And I think that the question of legality historically has been brushed over because people have seen it as, well, maybe it's not as important, that we really need to look into the validity and legality of these settlements, because we need to focus on the overall peace process and discussions about the two-state solution. The reality is, though, you can't have justice or equality without peace and a peaceful resolution that is fair to the both of the parties that are involved in the conflict.
And when we look at the kind of situation President Trump is involved in on a domestic level, Ms. Mary, if you could shed some light whether the arguments on how a lot of his donors are coming from Israel or connected to the Israel lobby, and so he looks at, appeasing them also with this statement.
Yes, look, there is a lot of literature online at the moment talking about Trump's motivations for appeasing certain groups and appeasing voters, particularly the evangelical group, who support the Jewish home for Israelis alone. They support the return of all Jews back to Israel. And it's kind of, it is actually a more philosophical and theological and theoretical push for Israel and for that religious desire, if you like. We do have to remember that Israel is classified as the Holy Land. So Trump is possibly appeasing to all of these evangelical voters who want to support a full state of Israeli, Jewish citizens without the Palestinian population involved. So that's certainly a possibility. I think that's a feasible argument. The other thing I wanted to say in relation to this issue is Israel constantly and continuously claiming that it's the only democracy in the Middle East. It prides itself as being an example of progression and the leader of human rights in the region, where sadly we are seeing these types of treatment towards Palestinian people too often from the state of Israel or the Israeli government or administration. So we need to look at why Israel. Why does it think it's justified in carrying out these actions? Why does it continuously persecute the Palestinian people? Why does it continuously not allow Palestinians to exist in their full-fledged human rights, as Israelis want their human rights and the Jewish people want their right to return? Why isn't Israel giving the same rights to the Palestinian people who do belong? That is their homeland. And that's not questionable. The short answer is, Ayza, is Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu and the far right do not see that it's breaching any international law. They do not see the West Bank as occupied, and they do not see that the Palestinian or Palestine existed as a sovereign state before the creation of Israel in 1948. And that is the bottom line.
And Ms. Mary, good points there. I want to come to you here, Mr. Yousef. Also, I want to add in here whether Israel doesn't see it's breaching international law or doesn't care for or doesn't pay heed to what international law says, especially if it goes against its own priorities. Here, before we proceed, Mr. Yousef and Ms. Mary, I want to run a video that became viral on social media forums. It's a video where the Israeli ambassador, Mr. Danny Dayan, was trying to give a speech, a lecture in Harvard, and they silently leave the room. And later on, Mr. Dayan also tweeted calling them losers and other things. It was really quite sad. Honestly, his reaction, I believe he wrote a bunch of losers in a tweet after the lecture. Now, this video essentially highlights, at least for me and those who support the Palestinian cause, recognize this as an illegal occupation, Mr. Yousef, as something that is very heartening, something that we worry that the world is becoming blind to, insensitive to. Mr. Yousef, your sentiments on the kind of awareness that now exists on Israel's illegal occupation?
Yes, I think the decision-making institutions, whether it was presidency or the Congress or other lobbies inside the United States, have the power to make such resolution in support for Israel. But relating what you have showed, relating the lecture and belief of the leaving of the students, we have raising awareness among the public in the United States and in other European states about the Palestinian cause and about the reality what's going on in the Palestinian territories. So the crimes by Israel, the illegal procedures and the illegal occupation and the restriction of movement, also attacks against Gaza and many the siege also that has been imposed on Gaza for 13 years now. I think these crimes and these illegal actions by Israel and those who are supporting Israel are no more hidden, because we have other alternative media outlets that through which people try to show the reality and to show the real face of Israel. So the Israeli occupation now trying to fix such picture and try to cooperate with the great platforms such Facebook, Twitter, and other companies in order to put restrictions on the Palestinian content that exposes Israeli crimes and Israeli procedures and Israel's occupation against Palestinian people. I think the awareness among people is raising, and the picture about Israeli occupation and its crimes is becoming more clear. But honestly, the effect of the people inside, and I mean the public levels inside the United States and the European states, it's increasing, but we haven't reached the point to change the policy made by the institutions who are making decisions and supporting Israel, such as government or presidency or any other lobbies.
That's a really interesting point, Mr. Yousef, especially when you refer to organizations like the UN General Assembly. I mean, as much as they would like to go ahead and condemn these kind of moves made by the Israeli government, we still know that as a fact, it was the UN Watch director Hillel Neuer, who declared essentially said that the UN's assault on Israel with a torrent of one-sided resolution is surreal. I mean, this is the kind of people who are running what should be a neutral, impartial organization looking out for human rights. Ms. Mary, we're running out of time, but I really want to touch here is if we're looking at the geopolitical situation at the moment, we're seeing how US, with Trump's isolationist strategy, foreign policy or the lack thereof, has kind of isolated himself from a region, especially like Middle East, where there's so much conflict going on. Israel is a big role to play in what is unfolding there. Could we foresee, if with some optimism in the future, that this isolationist policy would also cost Israel the kind of support it needs to keep going with this illegal occupation?
Look, a few things. I think when we look at the Middle East in its entirety, it's actually the unhealthiest, and it's in the worst state it's ever been, I believe, in this century. With the Syrian revolution, Lebanon now, Palestine has been an ongoing issue since 1948. Mm-hmm. The Egyptian revolution, the instability that we've had in the Middle East has unfortunately been fueled by US foreign policy in the region. And I feel that perhaps the US administration at this time has taken a step back, washing its hands, saying, well, we're not responsible, where it has consecutively supported certain initiatives in the region. And I think it's very unfortunate that the US and both Israel declare their democratic approach and their passion and dedication to human rights all across the world, yet it doesn't seem to apply for people in the Arab world.
Okay, and Mr. Yousef, very quickly from you, I want to pick a question essentially referring to how a tiny country like Gambia would raise an issue on the plight of the Rohingyas, what has happened, the genocide in Myanmar, raising that case as with support of the OIC of 57 Islamic Muslim countries for Muslims who have been persecuted here in their own homeland. Why is it that that kind of support hasn't yet reached Palestine, a case that has been going on since, as Ms. Mary said, since 1948?
Simply because they're Muslims. They are Muslims. Because of that, we haven't here a lot of voices that are raised when some people is hurt here or there inside Israel or inside any other country. And by the way, many quests and researchers prove that Israel is providing weapons to Myanmar government, which uses such weapons against the people of Myanmar and is displacing the Muslims there. Mm-hmm. I think there's some sort of double standards when we are talking about the humanitarian crisis and the suffering of some people here or there. When you are talking about Myanmar, there's no, you find no interest by most of people who are talking about the importance of peace and living in peace for Israel, for example. Mm-hmm. I think the world here is dealing with a crisis with double standards because these are Muslims and these are not. And I think if we want to adopt the humanitarian standards to evaluate and judge these crimes, especially in Myanmar, I think we have to raise a lot of questions around many people and around many institutions who are talking about human rights in the world, especially the UN and especially the United States and also Israel. Like I said, weapons which are used by Myanmar's
are provided
army against
by Israel. Right, very quickly, Mary, I'm sorry to cut you short there. We've just got a few more seconds. Ms. Mary, the European Union did come out and say that that they are unchanged on their policy on how they see the Israeli occupation, that it is illegal. Any kind of weightage that EU might have or other countries who have condemned this move like Jordan?
Look, I really hope so, Ayza. I really hope that the EU and other international bodies and NGOs can really put pressure on Israel to stop this, this destruction on these people. The Palestinian people have been affected culturally, psychologically. Their day-to-day peace, their mental health, living in peace and security is not possible for them. It's not possible for Palestinian families, for Palestinian mums and dads to say, oh, I want to put my child in this school, or I want to think about this healthcare program for my family, or I want to work here. I mean, Palestinian people we have to remember, they are obstructed on a daily basis. They can't move without military checkpoints. So we've lived with this problem in the Middle East. Palestinians have been expelled to Jordan, to Lebanon, to Syria since 1948, and we need a solution. I'm not saying that the Jewish people it's not their homeland as well. Yousef did describe this problem as, correct me if I'm wrong, Yousef, but a Muslim problem. Mm-hmm. But it's not. It's a regional problem. The U.S. foreign policy and the Israeli issue with Palestinians, and there are Palestinian Christians who've also been exiled, and they've lost their heritage.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mary and Mr. Yousef, giving us your insight into the situation in Palestine. You saw heartbreaking footage on your screens just as we were discussing this of Palestinians continuously being fired at with live ammunition by Israeli forces as they protest since the protest of the March of Return has started last year. And we'll keep you updated as this story moves forward. Right now, it's time to say goodbye.